Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into something
Mm.
pretty interesting. It's the potential role of some natural compounds called polyphenols in vitiligo.
Awesome.
And I think it might offer some new insights for those who are dealing with this condition or even just interested in learning more about it.
Right.
So just to get us all on the same page real quick,
Uh-huh.
vitiligo, it's a condition where you get these lighter patches of skin,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really caused by this complex interplay of a bunch of things going on.
Yeah, it's not just one thing. It's
Yeah.
kind of like a perfect storm of different factors that contribute.
Yeah.
So you have the genes that you inherit
Right.
that can make you more susceptible to it. And then you
Mhm.
have your own immune system kind of going rogue and starting to target these pigment-producing cells called melanocytes.
Right.
And then you throw in some oxidative stress, which is like an imbalance of these harmful molecules in the body,
Right.
and top it off with environmental factors, and boom, you got vitiligo.
It's right.
It's a lot
Right.
going on.
It's a lot going on.
Yeah,
And right now the ways that we try to manage it are really just as varied as its causes.
for sure.
You know, we're
Yeah.
using medications to kind of calm down the immune system,
Right.
trying to help the body's defenses against that oxidative stress with things like antioxidants,
Mm-hmm.
even using light therapy to try and encourage those pigment cells to get back to work.
Yep.
So that's kind of the backdrop. And this is where these polyphenols come in, these
Exactly.
compounds you find in plants. And I think what's really interesting is, you know, they've got all these really remarkable
Oh,
properties.
yeah, they're like nature's little helpers.
Yeah.
They're great at like mopping up these harmful molecules that cause damage.
Right.
They can help reduce inflammation, and they can even influence how our immune system behaves.
Right.
So they've got a lot of potential.
Yeah. So our goal today is to really explore, you know, what does the science say so far about how these polyphenols might be relevant when it comes to vitiligo?
Exactly. And I think one of the things to remember is because vitiligo has so many different aspects to it,
Right.
the immune system, the pigment cells, that stress we talked about,
Mm.
the idea of one simple solution is probably not realistic.
Right.
But what's so exciting about polyphenols is they might be able to tackle several of these areas at once.
Right. It's like a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into how these things might actually work with vitiligo,
Yeah,
I think it's good to kind of understand, you know, what are polyphenols?
sure.
I mean, we know they come from plants, but are there different types we should know about?
Yeah, there's actually four main families or groups of polyphenols based on their chemical structure.
Okay.
And the biggest one you've probably heard of, it's the flavonoids.
Yep.
They're kind of like the workhorses of the polyphenol world,
Okay.
involved in so many things from fighting inflammation to neutralizing harmful molecules,
Huh.
even being studied for their potential in cancer research. And within the flavonoid family, you've got different subgroups
Okay.
like flavonols, which are found in things like onions and kale and apples.
Okay.
They're known for their antioxidant properties.
Uh-huh.
Then you have flavones found in parsley celery.
Right.
And then flavonthreols, also called catechins, and those are in tea cocoa berries.
Okay.
Super strong antioxidants.
Okay. So we're talking green tea.
Yeah, green tea, black tea.
Got it.
Then you've got flavonones in citrus fruits, isoflavones in soy, and anthocyanins, which are those bright pigments you see in berries and grapes.
Oh.
They're also thought to have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects.
So already within just that flavonoid group, there's a lot of variety.
Tons of variety.
Yeah.
But then you've got the other families too.
Okay. What's next?
Well, next up is phenolic acids, another diverse bunch,
Okay.
known for their antioxidant and anti-inflammatory abilities.
Mhm.
And some subcategories here include hydroxybenzoic acids found in berries and nuts, and hydroxycinnamic acids, which you'll find in things like coffee and cinnamon.
So everyday stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Cool. What else?
All right, so the third family is called still beans. It's smaller, but it includes a real rock star, resveratrol.
Oh yeah, resveratrol. You hear about that a lot.
It's gotten a lot of attention for its potential to reduce inflammation and support heart health.
Mm?
And you can find it in red wine grapes, peanuts.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and the last of the main groups.
That would be the lignans.
Okay.
They're often found in seeds and grains.
Okay.
And they're interesting because they can act kind of like estrogen in the body.
Huh. Interesting. Okay.
Some examples include secosclerosyresenol, which is found in flax seeds and sesame seeds,
Okay.
and materasenol present in whole grains and vegetables.
Okay. So I mean, across these four main groups, we're talking about a pretty wide range of foods.
Absolute.
I mean, are there any other notable polyphenols that maybe don't fit into those categories?
Yeah, there are a couple more worth mentioning. Curcuminoids, which are the active components in turmeric,
Right.
they're incredibly well researched for their powerful anti-inflammatory effects.
Hmm.
And then you've got tannins, which give that slightly bitter taste to tea wine and pomegranates.
Okay, so it sounds like, if you're eating a pretty varied diet, lots of fruits, vegetables, and other plant-based foods, you're probably getting a good mix of these polyphenols naturally.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types, but can you just recap like the common sources again?
Sure. So think colorful fruits, apples, berries, grapes, cherries,
Okay.
a rainbow of vegetables, onions, broccoli, spinach,
Got it.
beverages like green and black tea, coffee, even red wine in moderation, of course.
Okay.
And then nuts and seeds like almonds and flax seeds. And
Hmm.
don't forget about the herbs and spices like turmeric and cinnamon.
Right.
And legumes like lentils.
Okay, so I mean, we know that these polyphenols are generally considered to be good for us, but beyond their potential role in vitiligo,
Mm-hmm.
are there other benefits that are pretty well documented?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like what?
Well, like we talked about, they're powerful antioxidants, which means they can neutralize those unstable molecules in the body that can cause damage.
Right.
They also have significant anti-inflammatory effects.
Hmm.
They can influence the balance of our gut bacteria, which is super important for overall health.
Right.
And they've even been linked to a lower risk of things like heart disease, certain cancers, and even some brain-related conditions.
Wow. Okay, so clearly important for our overall well-being.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's bring it back to vitiligo.
Yeah.
We know that oxidative stress plays a significant role in how this condition develops and how it progresses.
Right.
So how do polyphenols kind of fit into this puzzle?
Yeah, that's a really critical connection.
Mhm.
So remember, oxidative stress is basically when you have this imbalance between those damaging molecules and the body's ability to counteract them.
Right.
And in vitiligo, these reactive molecules can directly harm those melanocytes, those pigment-producing cells,
Right.
which contributes to their loss. And that's where the antioxidant capabilities of polyphenols come in.
Okay, so specifically in vitiligo, how do these polyphenols act as antioxidants?
Well, there's a couple of key ways.
Okay.
First, many polyphenols, especially those flavonoids like the catechins in green tea that we talked about,
Mm-hmm.
phenolic acids and resveratrol,
Right.
they can directly grab onto and neutralize those harmful free radical,
Okay.
kind of like little Pac-Man gobbling them up.
Yeah, like little sponges
Exact.
soaking up the bad stuff.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second way?
Well, this one's pretty cool.
Okay.
Some polyphenols can actually activate a master switch in the body called NRF2.
NRF2. Okay, I've never heard of that.
It's kind of a big deal.
Go ahead.
The NRF2 pathway is essentially the body's main defense system against oxidative stress.
Okay.
So when certain polyphenols activate NRF2, it's like sending a signal to the body
Right.
to produce more of its own antioxidant enzymes.
Okay, so it's like boosting our own internal defenses.
Exactly. And these enzymes then work to protect the pigment cells from that internal stress.
So it's like a double whammy. They're fighting the damage directly, but also helping our bodies build up a stronger defense.
Exactly, a two-pronged approach.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So another key aspect of vitiligo is, the immune system kind of going haywire
Yeah,
and attacking those pigment cells.
right.
So can polyphenols help kind of regulate these immune responses?
They can, and this is another area where their potential is really exciting.
Okay.
So remember, vitiligo involves this immune-driven destruction of melanocytes,
Right.
largely by these immune cells called CD8 plus T cells,
Uh-huh.
and the release of these inflammatory signals, or cytokines,
Right.
and polyphenols seem to be able to influence this immune dysfunction in several ways.
Okay, well, how?
Well, one important way is by calming down the production of those pro-inflammatory cytokines.
Okay.
Certain polyphenols have been shown to reduce the release of signals like TNF-alpha and interferon gamma, which are involved in that immune attack on melanocytes. For example, curcumin from turmeric and EGCG from green tea are both known for their anti-inflammatory effects, partly through this mechanism.
Okay, so if you can lower those inflammatory signals, you might be able to reduce the intensity of the attack.
Exactly.
Okay, what about those CD8 plus T cells themselves? Can polyphenols do anything about those?
Yeah, they can actually, research suggests they might be able to help regulate the activity of those T cells,
Okay,
potentially making them less aggressive towards the melanocytes.
that would be great.
Right, and there's even some evidence that polyphenols could encourage the development and function of regulatory T cells, or TREGs.
What are those?
They're a different type of immune cell that helps to keep the immune system in check
Okay.
and prevent it from overreacting, which could be really beneficial in an autoimmune condition like vitiligo.
So it's like shifting the balance of the immune response in a more helpful direction.
Exactly.
I see. Okay, and you mentioned something earlier about the JAK-STAT pathway.
Oh, right. Yeah.
How does that fit in?
So the JAK-STAT pathway is like a communication network within immune cells.
Okay.
It's what drives their activation and the production of those inflammatory cytokines.
Okay.
And by interfering with this pathway, polyphenols can further help to reduce immune activation
Okay.
and the resulting damage to melanocytes.
So it's like another layer of immune modulation.
Exactly. And this is actually really relevant because some current treatments for vitiligo specifically target the same pathway.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're seeing some overlap there.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
it is.
Okay, so polyphenols are doing a lot to address the immune side of things. But what about the melanocytes themselves?
Right.
In vitiligo, their ability to produce melanin, the pigment that gives our skin its color, is reduced.
Right.
So can polyphenols help with that too?
They can, and this is another really exciting area.
Okay.
Supporting melanogenesis, the process of making melanin, is a primary goal in managing vitiligo.
Right.
And polyphenols have shown a lot of promise here.
Okay.
Well, one way is by activating a key enzyme called tyrosinase.
Tyrosinase, isn't that like the main enzyme for making melanin?
Exactly. Tyrosinase is like the worker bee of melanin production.
Got it.
And certain polyphenols, like resveratrol, have been shown to increase the activity of this enzyme.
Okay.
So by boosting tyrosinase, they can enhance melanin synthesis and potentially help restore pigment in those affected areas.
So that's pretty direct.
Yeah.
Just boosting the production. Are there other ways that polyphenols can help those pigment cells?
Yeah, there are.
Okay.
Another mechanism involves something called MITF.
MITF.
It stands for microphthalmia-associated transcription factor.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But it's basically like the conductor of the orchestra for melanocyte development and function.
Okay.
It controls the activity of several genes involved in making melanin, including tyrosinase,
Right.
as well as other important enzymes.
Right.
And some polyphenols can actually increase the expression of MITF,
Which
which then boosts the entire melanin production process.
wow. So it's not just turning on one switch, but it's like
No.
making sure all the players are there and ready to go.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay. And anything else?
Well, lastly, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier,
Okay.
by reducing that cellular stress and inflammation,
Right.
polyphenols can also protect melanocytes from dying off.
Okay.
So by keeping those pigment-producing cells alive and healthy, they can continue to do their job of making melanin.
That's really cool. Okay. So it's amazing how these compounds are interacting with all these different aspects of vitiligo.
It is.
You also mentioned that polyphenols can influence signaling pathways within cells.
Right.
So how does that fit into all of this?
Well, that's another really important layer of their potential.
Okay.
Polyphenols can interact with various communication networks within cells that are relevant to vitiligo.
Okay.
For example, they can modulate the MAPK pathway, which is involved in cell growth, survival, and importantly, melanin production.
Okay.
So by influencing this pathway, polyphenols can impact these critical functions in melanocytes.
So it's like fine-tuning the cell's internal communication system.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. Are there other signaling pathways that are relevant here?
Yeah, there are a couple others.
Right.
The Wnt beta-catenin pathway is crucial for the development and survival of melanocytes.
Right.
And research suggests that some polyphenols can activate this pathway, which could help support the health and longevity of those pigment cells.
Gotcha.
And then there's the PI3-catnac pathway,
Okay.
which is known to promote both melanocyte survival and melanin production.
Right.
And polyphenols have been shown to enhance signaling through this pathway as well.
So they're not just acting directly on the enzymes or immune cells, but they're also influencing these broader communication systems within the cells themselves.
Right.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot.
We have.
We've talked about their antioxidant effects, how they modulate the immune system, how they can promote pigment production, and their influence on these signaling pathways. Are there any other potential ways that polyphenols might be beneficial in vitiligo?
Yeah, there are a couple of other interesting possibilities.
Okay.
Well, one is through epigenetic regulation.
Okay.
Polyphenols might actually be able to influence how our genes are expressed without actually changing the DNA sequence itself.
So like influencing how our genes are turned on or off.
Exactly. And this could potentially improve the resilience of melanocytes and reduce immune-related damage
Oh, okay.
by subtly altering the activity of certain genes within those cells.
That's pretty advanced stuff.
It is.
Okay. And you also mentioned the skin microbiome.
Right.
What about that?
Yeah, so while it might not be as directly linked to the pigment cells themselves,
Okay.
the community of microorganisms living on our skin is becoming increasingly recognized as playing a role in skin health.
Right.
And in some cases of vitiligo, there have been links to imbalances in this microbiome.
Okay.
Polyphenols have some antimicrobial properties,
Uh-huh.
so they could potentially help maintain a healthier balance of that skin microbiota,
Okay.
which might indirectly be beneficial for some people with vitiligo.
Got it. Okay, so it seems like the potential benefits here are pretty wide-ranging.
They are.
So what about how polyphenols might work with the existing treatments for vitiligo?
Right.
Could they potentially make those treatments more effective?
That's a great question, and the early research is really promising.
Okay.
There's definitely potential for what we call synergistic effects, meaning they could work together with existing treatments to enhance their effectiveness.
Okay.
For instance, when combined with light therapy like narrowband UVB,
Right.
polyphenols might help to reduce the cellular stress that can be caused by the UVB
Okay.
and potentially enhance those pigment-producing cells' response to the light, leading to better repigmentation.
Okay, and what about medications?
Similarly, when used with traditional immune-modulating medications, polyphenols could potentially further reduce inflammation
Right.
and improve the overall outcomes.
So they're not necessarily replacements, but they could be really valuable additions to the approaches we already have. Okay, so you mentioned earlier a few specific polyphenols that are particularly interesting when it comes to vitiligo research.
I did.
Can you remind us what those are
Yeah.
and why they're so promising?
So resveratrol is still a big one
Okay.
because of those strong antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties we talked about,
Right.
and its ability to boost melanin production.
Right.
Curcumin from turmeric is another important one, mainly for its ability to reduce that cellular stress and dampen down those inflammatory pathways.
Right.
Then you've got EGCG from green tea,
Right.
which is showing promise because it can protect against cellular damage
Right.
and influence immune responses.
Okay.
And finally, quercetin, which is found in foods like onions and apples, has shown potential in promoting pigment production and protecting melanocytes from stress.
Okay, so I mean, these are just a few examples, but they really illustrate the potential here.
They do.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about polyphenols and vitiligo?
I think the main takeaway is that polyphenols seem to work through these multiple interconnected pathways that address the core issues we see in vitiligo.
Right.
So they can combat that cellular stress, they can help to rebalance the overactive immune system,
Right.
and they can support the function of those pigment-producing cells.
Right.
And by targeting these underlying factors, they offer this kind of broad spectrum approach that holds a lot of promise.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really interesting candidates for what are often called integrative therapy.
Exactly.
You know, those approaches that bring together different ways of supporting health and well-being alongside conventional treatments.
Right. It's not about replacing what we're already doing.
Right.
But it's about finding ways to enhance those treatments and support the body's natural healing processes.
And it's important to remember that the research is still ongoing.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, we need more studies to really understand how best to use these polyphenols in a clinical setting
For sure.
and to confirm their long-term effects.
Right. But the current understanding is really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really fascinating deep dive for me.
Me too.
It's amazing to see how these naturally occurring compounds could offer new ways of thinking about and potentially managing a condition like vitiligo.
Yeah,
And it really makes you think about the role that diet can play in skin health.
absolutely.
You know, maybe our listeners will be inspired to do some more research on their own about the connection between what we eat and various skin conditions.
Yeah, I think that's a great takeaway.
This field with a lot of exciting possibilities.
For sure.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.